And I am happy. Thank you, Sophie and Pedro. Something good came out of it. Sorry I y'all relationship up, but thank you for mine.
Pedro, I'm not ready.
Sophie, I just felt for your pain and everything. I'm sorry.
You don't feel my pain. You feel for Pedro's pain.
Sophie's world flipped the second she overheard what she believed were whispers meant to undermine her. A storm forming in her chest as a single thought consumed her mind. Did Liz really talk to Pedro about her? Her pulse raced, and for the first time in weeks, her confidence wavered. Replaced by a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief, she kept replaying the same scenario over and over, each loop tightening the knot in her stomach, imagining Pedro hearing words she never wanted him to know. Words that could twist the truth and plant doubt where there was none. Sophie's mind was a battlefield of suspicion. Every instinct screaming that her safe little world had been pierced, and the one person she had allowed herself to lean on might now see her differently because of someone else's voice. Pedro's silence didn't help. It was as if the air itself had turned cold between them. Every message left unread, every call unanswered, leaving Sophie floating in a haze of uncertainty. She remembered their last conversations, the laughter, the shared jokes, the promises whispered across hotel rooms and beaches, and then the sudden, crushing void. It wasn't just the absence of words, it was the absence of acknowledgement, a ghosting that felt deliberate, almost surgical in its precision. Sophie's thoughts twisted with every second Pedro didn't respond. Had Liz really warned him that Sophie wasn't ready? Had she planted a seed that grew into Pedro's sudden distance? The question spiraled endlessly, and Sophie felt cornered, unsure whether to confront, retreat, or demand answers that might never come. Amid this whirlwind of doubt and frustration, Julia emerged as the voice of reason. Or at least the person willing to try. Julia, who had seen these patterns before, tried to navigate the delicate space between Sophie's fiery emotions and Pedro's cold silence. She understood the stake, the way every action could escalate or soothe, and she knew that Sophie needed a bridge. Someone who could reach Pedro when Sophie couldn't. Yet even Julia sensed the precariousness of the moment. A single misstep could make Pedro retreat further, or worse, solidify Sophie's insecurities into full-blown confrontation. In her own way, Julia carried the tension of peacemaker, aware that her involvement could either mend a fracture or widen it irreversibly. Hey, I'm Sabrina, and welcome back to TLC Drama Live. Sophie imagined hearing as she tried to rationalize her thoughts, wishing there were someone to hold her hand through this mess. If you love the most shocking 90-Day Fiancé moments and can't resist drama, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment because we are about to unpack the chaos Sophie is facing. Even thinking these words grounded her slightly, giving her a momentary shield against the storm of her own emotions, a chance to breathe and remember that she wasn't alone in watching this drama unfold. The audience, too, was drawn into her spiral, compelled to wonder who could be trusted and how fragile relationships could be when words spoken or overheard collided with raw feelings. Sophie's mind raced back to that girl's night out when Liz had laughed at something Sophie said. But now the laughter seemed sinister in hindsight, layered with hidden meanings and secrets Sophie believed were pointed at her. Every glance, every small gesture became a potential clue, proof that Pedro might already be seeing her through a lens distorted by Liz's warnings. She asked herself over and over, who told him? Was it really Liz? Could Pedro have misunderstood? Why wouldn't he respond? Each unanswered text, each ignored call felt like a mirror reflecting her insecurities back at her, magnified 100-fold. The lack of communication from Pedro was more than frustrating. It was a psychological minefield where every step felt dangerous, every thought amplified, and every emotion teetered on the edge of explosion. Meanwhile, Julia tried to mediate through subtle nudges, carefully crafting messages that wouldn't trigger defensiveness or suspicion. She knew Sophie's tendency to spiral, and she knew Pedro's need for space, but balancing the two was like walking a tightrope over a pit of uncertainties. Every word had weight, every pause had meaning, and every delay could escalate the tension. Sophie's volatility made the stakes higher. If Pedro interpreted her distress as manipulation or pressure, he might retreat entirely. Yet if he didn't respond, Sophie's fear of abandonment would only intensify, feeding the fire of jealousy and mistrust that Liz's alleged words had ignited. As hours turned into a long, anxious wait, Sophie's thoughts twisted further. She pictured Pedro with a skeptical look, questioning her readiness for the relationship, perhaps wondering if Julia's intervention was a sign of deeper insecurities or worse, confirmation of doubts Liz had whispered in his ear. Sophie felt herself wobbling between indignation and panic, wanting answers but terrified of the truth. Her emotions were raw, primal even, a mixture of desperation, anger, and longing. Each moment Pedro remained silent added layers of suspense, pulling her further into a vortex where rational thinking struggled to survive. Who could she trust? Was Liz really the villain, or was Sophie projecting her fears onto someone innocent? Could Pedro be hiding his own insecurities, creating distance not because of Liz, but because of the uncertainty he felt herself? Every scenario she imagined tightened the knot of tension in her chest, making her pulse hammer with both fear and anticipation. Sophie's world had shrunk to a series of unanswered messages and imagined conversations, a delicate web of assumptions and potential betrayals. And while Julia tried to mediate, Sophie felt her life hanging in limbo, her emotional stability dependent on one person who had chosen silence over conversation. Pedro's ghosting was more than inconvenient, it was a catalyst, a magnifier of every insecurity Sophie had ever tried to hide. It forced her to confront feelings she usually pushed aside, magnifying the contradictions within herself. She had previously told Pedro she might not be ready for a relationship, and yet now she was furious at Liz for suggesting the same. The hypocrisy cut deep, yet her focus remained on Pedro's reactions, not her own accountability. And as she sat in that liminal space of anger and fear, waiting for a message that might never come, the audience was left dangling alongside her, caught in the tension of unanswered questions, wondering if he would respond, and if the fragile threads of trust could survive the storm that had already begun to engulf them. Sophie's frustration had been simmering all day, but it boiled over the moment she saw Liz laughing across the table, a casual smile that Sophie swore was aimed right at her. Every step Liz took, every sip she made seemed like a silent confirmation of Sophie's worst fears. She leaned in, voice tight with accusation, asking why Liz would talk to Pedro about her, why she would question her readiness for a relationship, and why she thought she had the right to interfere. Liz blinked, genuinely startled, shrugging as if Sophie's fury had appeared out of nowhere. That blank, innocent expression only fueled Sophie's suspicion, twisting her perception into a narrative where every gesture from Liz was a deliberate act of sabotage. Sophie's tone fluctuated between sharp sarcasm and raw vulnerability, each word loaded with the weight of betrayal. She pointed out how she had confided in Pedro about her fears, how she had admitted she might not be ready, and yet somehow Liz's alleged warnings felt like a personal attack. The hypocrisy stung. Sophie herself had been open about her hesitations, but now she wanted Liz to be silent, to shield her from consequences. Her emotions tangled, rage mixing with fear that Pedro might now see her differently, might believe Liz over her. Every accusation she threw felt justified in her own mind, yet each one revealed a deeper insecurity, a fear that she was already losing ground in Pedro's eyes. Liz's attempts to clarify only made things worse. Her words were calm, careful, measured, the kind of language meant to soothe, not escalate, but in Sophie's ears they sounded patronizing, manipulative even. Every explanation, every soft laugh, every defensive shrug became proof that Liz was playing a game Sophie didn't understand, a game where Sophie herself had become the pawn. Julia, standing nearby, watched the storm unfold, understanding that any sudden move from either side could push the argument beyond repair. Her own subtle cues, a hand on Sophie's shoulder, a tilted head toward Liz, were tiny interventions meant to cool the heat. Yet even they risked being misinterpreted, evidence of favoritism or betrayal in Sophie's tense gaze. Sophie's eyes darted, scanning Liz for micro-expressions that might confirm her suspicions, every smile, every twitch, every breath becoming a piece of a puzzle she was desperate to solve. Was Liz really innocent, or was she masking delight at Sophie's discomfort? The mind can do strange things when it feels threatened, and Sophie's imagination began to fill the gaps with scenarios more dramatic than reality. She questioned herself even as she accused. Was she overreacting, letting paranoia dictate her behavior? Or was Liz truly crossing a line that no friend should cross? Each hesitation fed the emotional volatility, making Sophie's reaction sharper, louder, and impossible to ignore. Body language became a battlefield. Liz's relaxed posture seemed almost casual. Sophie's rigid stance radiated tension. Hands flew, pointing and gesturing, not just for emphasis, but as unspoken signals of dominance and defense. Sophie's pacing, the tapping of her foot, the clenched jaw, they all screamed urgency, anxiety, and raw emotion. Liz's subtle shifts, a slight lean backward, a soft inhale, a measured nod, communicated restraint, calm, or possibly hidden amusement. The ambiguity left Sophie swinging between rage and doubt, each oscillation intensifying the drama. Julia tried to step closer, offering grounding words, but Sophie's focus was locked entirely on Liz, her peripheral awareness tuned to nothing else, every nerve on edge. The conversation spiraled quickly. Sophie brought up past events, minor comments Liz had made, turning them into evidence of some larger scheme. Liz tried to respond with logic, pointing out inconsistencies in Sophie's accusations, highlighting that Sophie had already admitted uncertainty to Pedro, yet Sophie's emotional lens filtered out any rational defense. Witty commentary could almost be inserted here. Watching Sophie argue, it was impossible not to notice the irony. Her insistence on fairness while wielding double standards with surgical precision. The audience could feel the tension, empathizing with Sophie's hurt, but also questioning whether she was constructing enemies from shadows, whether Liz's calm was genuine or tactical. Julia's presence was critical. She tried subtle interventions, repeating points softly, nodding in ways that encouraged dialogue, but her very efforts became another source of tension. Sophie interpreted Julia's guidance as partiality, a reminder that even allies could be implicated in betrayal. The emotional manipulation, or perceived manipulation, was dizzying, a tangled web where intention and perception collided. Every word felt like it could tip the scales, every pause a potential landmine. Sophie's chest tightened, her mind racing, her voice rising, and the laughter and chatter around them became almost deafening in contrast to the storm brewing at that table. Sophie's accusations became more pointed, more layered, yet each one inadvertently revealed her own insecurities. She wanted to be seen as wronged, betrayed, unfairly judged, yet every sentence she spat out contained traces of fear. Fear that Pedro might believe Liz. Fear that she had lost control. Fear that her honesty about not being ready could be weaponized against her. Liz's calm, polite responses were misread as smugness, encouragement, or silent judgment, feeding a feedback loop that magnified every imagined slight into proof of conspiracy. The audience is left to question themselves. Is Sophie reading too much into small gestures, or is there genuine malice at play? The crescendo came when Sophie's frustration could no longer be contained. Words spilled over, rapid fire, raw, emotional, pleading for acknowledgement, for defense, for Pedro's attention. Liz, attempting to diffuse, only seemed to provoke more, and the argument reached a boiling point where rationality and restraint evaporated. Sophie stormed off, her emotions uncontained, leaving Liz and Julia behind, the table a battlefield of unresolved conflict, tension, and unanswered questions. Julia's eyes followed her retreating figure, the audience left wondering what her next move would be and whether she could repair the fractured energy before it bled into the rest of their relationships. Julia could feel the storm before it hit, standing at just the right distance between Sophie's fire and Liz's defensive calm. She had seen conflicts like this before, but nothing felt as combustible as Sophie's emotions tonight. Every word Sophie had shouted, every accusation she had hurled, seemed to echo louder in Julia's mind, each syllable carrying years of unspoken insecurities and attention, seeking impulses that Sophie barely recognized in herself. Julia knew Sophie's jealousy wasn't just about Pedro, it was about validation, about being seen, about being told she mattered even when her own doubts screamed the opposite. The room felt heavy with unsaid words, every glance a potential spark, every pause a threat to explode. Pedro's silence lingered like a shadow over the entire situation. Sophie's messages went unanswered, her calls ignored, and each act of ghosting magnified the tension tenfold. She replayed past conversations endlessly, trying to pinpoint a moment when things went wrong, trying to understand if Pedro's distance was a punishment, a test, or a reflection of Liz's supposed interference. Julia understood that Pedro's absence wasn't necessarily malicious. Sometimes avoidance is a response to pressure, confusion, or the fear of confrontation. But Sophie didn't see nuance in this moment, she saw betrayal. A confirmation of every fear she had harbored since the whispers she believed Liz had shared. Julia's attempts to intervene were careful, deliberate, measured. She leaned in gently toward Sophie, her voice soft but firm, reminding her that accusations without proof could spiral out of control. That interpreting intentions through a lens of jealousy often magnifies imagined slights into perceived attack. Yet, the more Julia tried to calm her, the more Sophie's defenses hardened. Every word meant to soothe was reframed in Sophie's mind as condescension. Every gesture of reason read as siding against her. It was a classic case of emotional projection. Sophie was battling her own fear of inadequacy while blaming the world for her insecurities. Yet, it wasn't one-sided. Liz's attempts to clarify, to remain calm, could easily be read as smug or dismissive, even when they weren't. Julia recognized that the audience needed both perspectives. Liz had no reason to stir the pot intentionally, but her composure in the face of Sophie's storm could be interpreted as gloating or manipulation. And Pedro, sitting silently on the other end of the communication spectrum, had created a vacuum of accountability. In that void, Sophie's imagination filled the space with the worst-case scenarios, while Liz's innocence was constantly questioned. It was a delicate triangle, each side reacting not just to reality, but to perception, to fear, to desire for attention, and to the human tendency to assume malice when emotions run high. Julia tried reframing the situation subtly, pointing out that Sophie's honesty with Pedro about not feeling ready could be seen as vulnerability rather than betrayal, that Liz's possible comments weren't necessarily harmful, and that Pedro's ghosting might stem from personal uncertainty rather than manipulation. Yet even as Julia spoke, the tension didn't abate. Sophie's need for immediate acknowledgement, for reassurance, for someone to declare her right and Liz wrong, made mediation feel almost impossible. Every calm word Julia offered risked being misread as an alignment with Liz. Every attempt to redirect Sophie toward introspection risked backfire. Sophie's body language mirrored the inner turmoil: crossed arms, tense shoulders, narrowed eyes, a mixture of defiance and desperation. Julia noticed the subtle tremble in Sophie's hands, the way her eyes darted toward her phone every few minutes, expecting a reply that wasn't coming. This was a person caught between longing and panic, clinging to narratives that supported her fear while dismissing evidence that contradicted it. Psychological insight suggested that Sophie's attention-seeking behavior wasn't manipulative by design. It was survival instinct in a relationship where communication had broken down, where ghosting amplified insecurities, and where perceived threats felt immediate and personal. At the same time, Julia had to navigate her own emotional tightrope. She couldn't allow herself to be pulled into taking sides publicly, yet she had to find a way to break the deadlock, to create a channel for clarity without escalating the conflict. It was a delicate balance, too much intervention, and she risked alienating Sophie too little, and Pedro's silence would continue to drive the spiral unchecked. Every word mattered, every tone was scrutinized, every glance could shift the trajectory of the night. As the argument stretched on, Sophie's energy oscillated between aggression and desperation, throwing accusations, questioning loyalties, and dissecting motives in a flurry of words. Julia remained a steady presence, listening, offering gentle guidance, and planting seeds of reason without trying to force compliance. She understood that Sophie needed space to process, yet also recognized that without action, Pedro's silence would continue to dominate the emotional landscape. And then, the decision crystallized in Julia's mind. She couldn't just mediate from the sidelines anymore. If Pedro continued to ignore Sophie, the cycle of jealousy, insecurity, and blame would persist, each minute magnifying the fallout. Julia realized she would have to step in directly, to send a message that could break the stalemate without making Sophie feel overruled or dismissed. It was risky. Pedro's response could either soothe or ignite further tension, but the alternative was watching the trio spin out into endless conflict. Sophie, unaware of Julia's plan, was consumed by her own storm. Her mind raced with questions about loyalty, trust, and honesty. Liz's calm remained a puzzle she couldn't solve. Pedro's ghosting was an enigma she couldn't decipher, and Julia's interventions were a double-edged sword she didn't fully trust. Every emotion was heightened, every gesture amplified, and the room seemed to shrink around the intensity of their interactions. Sophie's fury, insecurity, and longing created a potent mix, a pressure cooker of human emotion that could explode in multiple directions. Julia's plan to reach out to Pedro herself set the stage for a suspenseful turn. The audience was left hanging alongside Sophie, knowing that the next message could alter the dynamic entirely, that clarity or chaos was just a text away, and that the fragile equilibrium balancing jealousy, insecurity, and loyalty might finally tip one way or another. The stakes had never felt higher, and every second of silence from Pedro only made the resolution more urgent and the tension more unbearable. Pedro's response finally came, but not to Sophie. It landed in Julia's inbox instead. A simple message that instantly shifted the emotional gravity of the night. The silence that had plagued Sophie for days evaporated for a moment, replaced by the tension of uncertainty. Pedro's words were calm, concise, almost neutral, yet each one carried weight because of what it didn't say. The absence of apology, the absence of explanation, the absence of direct engagement with Sophie herself. It was a lifeline and a challenge all at once. A text that reopened the door but left the audience questioning whether stepping through would lead to relief or more chaos. Why had he ignored Sophie for so long? The motivations were a tangle of possibilities, each more intriguing than the last. Perhaps he had needed space to process, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of accusations and emotional storms that Sophie had unleashed. Maybe avoidance had felt like the easiest path, a way to sidestep confrontation while sorting through his own confusion. Emotional overwhelm could explain why he turned to Julia instead, someone perceived as neutral. A buffer between him and Sophie's intensity. It painted a picture of a man caught between loyalty, fear, and desire, navigating a landscape of human emotion that had grown almost too complicated to manage. For Sophie, though, the silence was devastating. She imagined every possible scenario. Pedro laughing at her perceived naivety, him taking Liz's side, or him simply moving on while she spiraled in self-doubt. The moment Pedro's text arrived to Julia, her absence in the loop became almost unbearable. Would she ever hear directly from him? Would he even acknowledge her feelings, or was this another step in a pattern of detachment and avoidance? The questions hung over her like storm clouds, heavy and relentless, and the audience could feel the weight of anticipation, caught between hope and dread. Julia's role as intermediary became fascinating to watch. Her calm, measured replies acted as a bridge, translating Sophie's chaos into a language Pedro could engage with without feeling cornered. There's a subtle irony here. The person who hadn't said a word in days had to speak through someone else, reminding us all how often communication in high-stakes relationships is less about honesty and more about navigation, strategy, and survival. Watching this unfold, it was impossible not to notice how complex human behavior becomes when emotions collide, and how silence can be as potent a weapon as any words spoken in anger. The audience is left to wonder. Does Pedro still care? Was this message a sign of lingering affection, or a neutral effort to maintain civility? And is Sophie even aware that Julia has become the conduit, that her partner's words are filtered through a friend rather than reaching her directly? The dynamics were fascinating, almost theatrical in their tension. Every missed call, every unread message, every delayed response added layers of meaning to a situation that could have been simple in another context. Watching the intricate push and pull of attachment, fear, and insecurity was almost like watching a high-stakes chess match where each player was emotionally naked, every move public, and the consequences immediate. Pedro's message itself was deceptively simple. He agreed to meet, a single sentence that carried so many implications. On one hand, it was a chance, a possibility that the relationship could continue, that the fractures could be repaired. On the other hand, it introduced uncertainty. Was this a genuine effort to reconnect, or a cautious, calculated move to test the waters without committing? The ambiguity was palpable, and every character involved felt the tension acutely. Sophie's emotions, already raw, now had a new dimension to grapple with. Hope intertwined with suspicion, desire mixed with dread. And then there's the behavior itself. Pedro's silence, the decision to respond through Julia, the pacing of the engagement. It's a perfect example of how avoidance functions in relationships. Avoidance isn't always malicious. Sometimes it's a coping mechanism, a way to prevent immediate conflict while emotions are heightened. But in high drama situations like this, avoidance can feel like rejection, like manipulation, even if the intention is entirely different. Sophie's overreactions in this light are almost understandable. She's processing not just the content of Pedro's actions, but the emotional vacuum he's left, the silence that amplifies every fear, and the perceived betrayal that fuels her narrative. Meanwhile, Julia navigates her own tension, aware that her involvement could either bridge the gap or exacerbate it. She carefully crafts messages that convey Pedro's willingness without inflaming Sophie's fears, balancing empathy with precision. Every emoji, every punctuation mark, every carefully chosen word carries the weight of potentially calming a storm or triggering another one. It's a reminder of how human relationships often operate not in straightforward lines of communication, but in networks of perception, mediation, and emotional strategy. For the audience, this moment is layered with suspense. Pedro's response is more than a text, it's a pivot point. It's the moment where the narrative could swing toward reconciliation or collapse entirely, where Sophie's trajectory could shift from despair to hope or deepen into mistrust. The tension is addictive because the stakes feel real, feelings are raw, behaviors are authentic, and consequences are immediate. The question hanging in the air is irresistible. Will Sophie get clarity, or will she misinterpret again, letting her insecurities dictate the next act? And as the message settles in, as Julia contemplates how to deliver it without sparking further chaos, the scene is set for a confrontation that could redefine the dynamic entirely. The uncertainty is delicious. Pedro agreed to meet. Yes, but what does it mean? Is it a genuine attempt to rebuild trust, or a cautious test of Sophie's reactions, a probe to see how far she might go to validate herself? Every possibility is open, every outcome imaginable, and the audience is left holding their breath, fully invested in the next move. He agreed to meet, but is it a trap or a second chance? Sophie's heart was a battlefield, every beat oscillating between hope, relief, and a simmering jealousy she couldn't quite suppress. Pedro had agreed to meet, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of possibility, a chance to reclaim some semblance of connection. But that hope was tangled up with anxiety, a knot of fear and expectation that made her pulse race and her thoughts spin. She replayed the moment over and over, imagining what his tone would be, what words he might choose, and whether his silence had been avoidance, confusion, or a calculated move to test her reaction. Every scenario seemed plausible, and every imagined outcome kept her on edge, teetering between optimism and dread. Then there was Liz. Sophie couldn't ignore the subtle shift in energy as Liz received attention from another man, a seemingly innocent interaction that Sophie immediately interpreted as a provocation. The way he lingered on her smile, the casual compliment, the little laughs they shared, every moment became fuel for Sophie's insecurities. Her jealousy wasn't rational. It wasn't about Liz herself, but about the perceived threat to her own place in Pedro's mind. Sophie's inner monologue spun endlessly, questioning not only Liz's intentions, but also her own worth, replaying past conversations and comparing every gesture to what she imagined she had lost in Pedro's eyes. The audience could feel her tension, caught in that whirlwind of longing, fear, and envy, wondering if she could navigate her emotions without letting them consume her. Sophie oscillated between two conflicting impulses: to trust Pedro, to believe in the meeting as a chance for clarity and reconciliation, and to prepare for the worst, imagining rejection, betrayal, or further distance. Her emotions were raw, exposed, and amplified by days of unanswered messages and overthinking. Every glance at her phone became a heartbeat in the story, each notification a potential lifeline or confirmation of her deepest fears. It was a classic emotional roller coaster, one where hope and dread collided in rapid succession, keeping Sophie and the audience on edge. The tension was further amplified by the dynamics with Liz. Even if Liz's interactions were harmless, Sophie's perception of threat magnified the stakes. Here was a reminder of how toxic cycles operate in relationships. Miscommunication breeds jealousy, Jealousy fuels overreaction, and overreaction triggers avoidance or defensiveness, perpetuating the loop. Sophie blamed Liz partially for Pedro's earlier distance, yet her own actions and words contributed to the turbulence. It was a delicate dance of cause and effect, each person reacting to perceived slights, and every escalation making reconciliation feel simultaneously urgent and impossible. The audience could sense the trap of emotion and behavior, a spiral many had witnessed but few could step out of without intervention or insight. Julia's presence, while stabilizing, also highlighted the precariousness of the situation. She offered gentle guidance, reminding Sophie to breathe, to focus on what was in her control, and to separate perception from intention. Yet Sophie's mind was racing too fast for rational reassurances to land fully. Each suggestion from Julia became another layer of decision-making. Should she follow the advice, act on impulse, or retreat and reassess? Her mental landscape was crowded with possibilities, each path carrying its own potential for heartbreak or vindication. Pedro's eventual appearance loomed like a question mark over every thought Sophie had. Would he show up on time? Would he approach with warmth or distance? Would he validate her feelings? Or would he leave her suspended between hope and rejection once again? The unpredictability made every second leading up to the meeting feel monumental. Sophie's anxiety manifested physically. Her hands trembled slightly, her stomach knotted, and her chest tightened with anticipation. The audience could feel her tension, fully invested in whether the meeting would calm the storm or fuel it further. Sophie's mind wandered to the blame shifting that had colored their interaction. She recognized, at least partially, how easy it had been to cast Liz as the villain, to paint Pedro as passive, and to frame herself as the unfairly wrong party. These cycles of blame were toxic, creating emotional feedback loops where every action was interpreted as a reaction rather than an independent choice. The brilliance or tragedy of human behavior in these moments was on full display. Intentions became secondary to perception, and every character's internal narrative collided with the external reality, creating a combustible mix that demanded resolution. Despite all the emotional turmoil, there was a spark of agency in Sophie. She was preparing herself mentally, rehearsing what she might say, weighing her emotions against the facts she knew, and trying to reclaim some sense of control in a situation dominated by uncertainty. Her preparation wasn't about manipulation, it was about self-preservation, about ensuring that when Pedro appeared, she could meet him without being overwhelmed by the spiral of jealousy and insecurity that had defined the past days. It was an attempt to navigate the high-stakes emotional battlefield she had been living in, balancing vulnerability with self-protection. And then there was the suspense, thick and tangible, hovering in the air like a storm about to break. The audience was left teetering alongside Sophie, questioning the outcome. Would Pedro show up? Would Sophie confront him calmly? Or would the intensity of her emotions erupt uncontrollably? Could she navigate the delicate line between hope and suspicion without tipping into chaos? Every heartbeat, every glance, every imagined scenario contributed to the tension, keeping viewers fully engaged and emotionally invested. Sophie straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and allowed herself a moment to center, knowing that what came next could change everything. Pedro's presence was imminent, the stakes were as high as they had ever been, and the emotional roller coaster she was on was about to reach its apex. Every decision she made in these moments could set the tone for resolution or further conflict, and every second of anticipation was magnified by the prior days of uncertainty, ghosting, and jealousy. Sophie prepared to confront Pedro, tension high, and the audience held their breath, caught in the gravity of a moment that could either heal or fracture the fragile threads of connection. The day of the meetup arrived like a storm on the horizon, and Sophie's nerves were taut, every thought racing faster than her heartbeat. She had rehearsed the conversation 100 times, imagining Pedro's words, his tone, even the way he might position himself in the room. Her mind teetered between hope and dread, and every step toward the meeting place felt like a step into unknown territory. The tension was almost cinematic. She could feel the weight of every unsent message, every unanswered call, every day of silence pressing down on her shoulders. Pedro arrived, casual, calm, almost deceptively composed. His body language was measured, restrained, with subtle cues that spoke louder than words. A relaxed stance, hands loosely at his sides, a faint neutral expression that seemed to radiate patience and detachment simultaneously. Sophie, in contrast, carried the energy of every unresolved emotion from the past week, her posture rigid, shoulders tense, gestures slightly sharp, her eyes scanning for micro-expressions that might give her insight into his mood or intention. The contrast was striking. A visual manifestation of power dynamics, Sophie's desperation versus Pedro's emotional detachment, an imbalance that made the meeting inherently dramatic. As they approached each other, every step seemed loaded with meaning. Sophie's gaze flicked between Pedro's eyes, his mouth, his gestures, searching for signs of care, indifference, or hidden agendas. Pedro's controlled movement suggested he had rehearsed nothing, yet everything about his presence communicated that he had thought carefully about this encounter. Julia lingered nearby, a silent observer, mediating in subtle ways, her presence both reassuring and tense. She understood that her role was now more crucial than ever. Too much guidance could feel like interference. Too little could allow the situation to spiral again. From the first words exchanged, it was clear that Sophie's emotions had the upper hand in intensity. Every sentence she spoke carried weight, rapid fire, and layered with years of insecurity, fear of abandonment, and hope for reconciliation. Pedro's responses were measured, even almost neutral, but each pause, each carefully chosen word carried subtext. There was a delicate dance unfolding. Sophie trying to assert herself emotionally to bridge the gap that silence had widened, and Pedro maintaining enough composure to avoid being swept into the emotional maelstrom. The audience could feel every microsecond of tension, every unspoken question hanging in the air like invisible threads connecting them. Sophie's body language betrayed everything she tried to hide. Hands fidgeting, shoulders shifting, her gaze darting at slight movements, searching for validation, reassurance, or signs that Pedro still cared. Pedro's own posture was calm, but his subtle cues, leaning slightly back, measuring eye contact, pacing his words carefully, communicated that he was aware of the imbalance and intent on maintaining control. It was a fascinating study in human behavior, how desperation and detachment interact, how each participant's internal narrative drives external expression, and how tension can manifest in the smallest gestures. Witty commentary almost writes itself here. Sophie, carrying a week's worth of imagined betrayals, was playing offense and defense simultaneously, her emotional energy practically radiating from her. Pedro, meanwhile, was the calm epicenter of the storm, each pause in conversation amplifying the suspense. Every sigh, every blink, every slight smile became fodder for interpretation, proof in Sophie's mind of care or indifference, depending on how the narrative bent at that moment. It was the kind of meeting where small details carried outsized weight, and every audience member could feel the tension coil tighter with each passing second. The conversation started with safe, surface-level topics, pleasantries, casual references, but the undercurrent of unspoken issues was palpable. Sophie's questions were pointed but polite, each carefully designed to elicit honesty, to gauge Pedro's intentions, and to protect herself from further disappointment. Pedro's answers were equally careful, neutral but honest, aiming to navigate a path between reassurance and detachment. The unspoken cues, the tilts of the head, the pauses, the slight shifts in posture communicated more than the words themselves. Julia watched quietly, knowing that these subtle interactions could either diffuse tension or escalate it without a single overt argument. The power dynamics were clear. Sophie's emotional intensity pressed forward, seeking validation and certainty, while Pedro's controlled detachment created an invisible boundary, keeping the emotional storm at bay. It was a delicate equilibrium, one that could shift at any moment depending on tone, gesture, or perceived intent. Sophie's mind raced with possibilities. Would he show care, indifference, or a hint of hidden agenda? Could she assert herself without overreacting, or would the past week's tension override rationality? Every subtle cue felt like a puzzle to decode, every pause a cliffhanger in its own right. As the meeting unfolded, it appeared on the surface that everything was fine. There were no dramatic outbursts, no yelling, no tears, just two people navigating the aftermath of silence and suspicion. Yet beneath the calm veneer, the audience could sense the hidden storm, every small gesture, every careful word, Every moment of hesitation hinted that the equilibrium was fragile. Sophie's hope was tempered by fear, Pedro's neutrality masked complexity, and Julia's watchful eye ensured that any misstep could either escalate or resolve the tension. And just when it seemed that the moment had reached a delicate balance, that they were threading the needle of emotional complexity perfectly, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred. A glance, a hesitation, a micro-expression that promised that not everything was as it seemed. The audience could feel it, sensing that beneath the apparent calm, a hidden twist was quietly gathering strength, ready to emerge when least expected. Everything seemed fine, but a hidden twist is brewing. Sophie's emotions hit a breaking point, and it was impossible to ignore. Every small movement, every casual glance Pedro cast elsewhere felt like a personal slight, a proof that her fears had been correct all along. Julia was present, watching closely, a silent anchor in the storm, but even her calm couldn't shield Sophie from the tidal wave of jealousy crashing through her mind. The tension crackled in the air, palpable and almost physical, as Sophie's reactions escalated from anxious glances to pointed questions and sharp remarks that left the room vibrating with suspense. Pedro, for his part, remained calm on the surface, but subtle cues betrayed his own emotional state. His shoulders shifted slightly, a hand ran through his hair, a pause lingered too long before he responded. These were small, almost imperceptible signs of discomfort, signaling that while he wasn't raising his voice, he was feeling the intensity of Sophie's scrutiny. Avoidance in this context was his shield, sidestepping direct conflict, trying to maintain composure, while the storm of emotions around him threatened to pull him in. The contrast between Sophie's visible intensity and Pedro's restrained detachment highlighted a classic tension in human behavior. One person's outward expression amplifying another's inward negotiation. Sophie's jealousy wasn't just about Pedro, it was amplified by every previous slight, every imagined betrayal, and, critically, by the attention Liz had been receiving from other men. Her mind raced through every moment of interaction, dissecting smiles, laughter, and gestures, interpreting them through a lens sharpened by insecurity. It's a psychological pattern familiar to many. When people feel vulnerable in relationships, they often externalize blame, projecting the source of their discomfort onto others rather than acknowledging their own role in creating distance. Sophie's accusations at that moment, though fiery and emotional, were rooted in fear of abandonment and the self-protective instinct to regain control in a situation where she felt powerless. Julia tried to interject gently, offering observations meant to ground Sophie, to redirect the energy without invalidating her emotions. She highlighted the fact that Pedro's detachment might not be rejection, that his pauses and subtle gestures didn't necessarily signal disinterest, and that Sophie's interpretation of Liz's attention could be amplified by her own insecurities. But Sophie, trapped in the whirlwind of jealousy, heard these not as advice, but as challenges, threats to her narrative, or evidence that she was being dismissed. This is the paradox of emotional intensity. The closer someone gets to a storm of feelings, the harder it is to hear reason, and the more likely misperceptions are to escalate conflict. Sophie's reactions grew increasingly layered, oscillating between desperation for reassurance and sharp, almost accusatory questioning. Each comment she made, each glance she cast was loaded with expectation, demanding that Pedro perform emotional validation, that he articulate commitment, or that he soothed the insecurities that had built over days of silence. Her jealousy-fueled behavior that, in a cycle common to high-drama relationships, pressured Pedro into avoidance. And his avoidance, in turn, amplified Sophie's perception of betrayal, creating a feedback loop that intensified emotional escalation. The audience can recognize the dynamic immediately. When distance is self-inflicted or passive, it often becomes a mirror reflecting intensified fears and accusations from the other party. Pedro tried to respond, carefully navigating Sophie's intensity, choosing words that were neutral but conciliatory, aiming to diffuse rather than inflame. Every pause, every measured sentence, every gentle adjustment of posture was his attempt to manage the emotional energy without creating further conflict. Yet Sophie's emotional radar was hyper-focused on perceived slights, interpreting neutrality as indifference and caution as calculated avoidance. This mismatch in perception created tension that could explode at any moment. Julia's presence provided a buffer, but even she could feel the room teetering on the edge, every small gesture magnifying stakes that were already sky high. The intensity of Sophie's reactions highlighted a fascinating aspect of human behavior. How jealousy can make minor cues feel monumental, how insecurity can turn neutral gestures into perceived threats, and how blame often shifts outward even when the origin is internal. Sophie wanted to see betrayal where there might be none, to assign responsibility to Pedro, Liz, or circumstances, rather than confronting the reality that her own fears and reactions were shaping the narrative. The psychology here is layered: fear of rejection, need for validation, and inability to tolerate ambiguity all collide to create an emotional perfect storm. As the conversation wore on, subtle hints of a repeating pattern began to emerge. Sophie's intensity, Pedro's calm avoidance, and the presence of external perceived threats like Liz suggested that the cycle could repeat itself, that unresolved insecurities might continue to drive conflict in future interactions. The stakes were high. Every word, every glance, every subtle gesture was potentially laying the groundwork for either reconciliation or further estrangement. For the audience, this creates an irresistible question. Is the tension about to break into resolution, or are we witnessing the first crack in a repeating emotional pattern that will spiral further? And just as Sophie thought she might gain control, the emotional landscape shifted unexpectedly. A phrase from Pedro, a casual glance from Liz nearby, or perhaps a subtle silence from Julia, whatever it was, it blindsided Sophie, making her question everything she thought she knew about loyalty, trust, and emotional intent. Her mind spun, caught between hope and suspicion, and the audience was left in suspense, fully invested in what would happen next, knowing that the fragile equilibrium could fracture at any moment. Sophie felt blindsided, and the audience was left asking, is this the end? Pedro's behavior shifted again, and Sophie's emotions went from tense anticipation to outright confusion in a matter of minutes. One moment he seemed attentive, leaning in slightly, listening as if every word she said mattered. The next, his gaze drifted away. His responses clipped, measured, almost detached. The oscillation between engagement and withdrawal was maddening. Sophie found herself questioning every micro-expression, every inflection of his voice, as if he held some secret code she had to crack. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and impossible to ignore, and the audience could feel the tension coil tighter with every heartbeat. This was the quintessential roller coaster of modern relationships, especially the type we watch unfold on reality TV. Pedro's unpredictability wasn't malicious. It was a combination of emotional overwhelm, hesitation, and a desire to maintain some control. But to Sophie, it felt like a game she hadn't agreed to play. Her mind raced. Did he still care? Was this genuine interest or a test of her reactions? And just as quickly as hope flared, uncertainty would sweep in, extinguishing it. The unpredictability itself became a character in the story, a puppet master pulling strings that Sophie didn't realize were being manipulated by perception, fear, and unspoken tension. Julia remained a steady observer, silently decoding the cues Sophie missed. She noticed Pedro's subtle cues, how he shifted his weight when he was uncomfortable, how his tone changed when he felt pressed, and how he hesitated before answering questions about the past. Julia knew the dance of alternating highs and lows was part of human behavior under stress. Sophie's intensity demanded attention. Pedro's measured detachment was a protective response, and together, they created a volatile push and pull that could escalate at any moment. It was a delicate equilibrium, fragile and unpredictable, yet endlessly compelling to watch. Sophie's reactions mirrored the roller coaster. When Pedro seemed present and engaged, relief washed over her, her body relaxing slightly, her voice softening, her eyes lighting up with hope. But any hint of detachment, a glance away, a pause, or a non-committal response sent her spiraling back into insecurity. The swings were dramatic, emotional, and real. The audience could sense the immediacy of each fluctuation, caught in the tension between hope and doubt, empathy and skepticism. It was emotionally addictive, a perfect storm of highs and lows that kept viewers invested moment by moment. And then came the humor. The almost absurd unpredictability of relationships that on paper are simple but in practice are anything but. Sophie tried to interpret Pedro's every movement as intentional, while Pedro, consciously or not, maintained an aloof neutrality that amplified her speculation. It was like watching someone attempt to read a book upside down. The story was there, but the interpretation could go wildly off track depending on perspective. Julia, observing quietly, couldn't help but smirk at the classic scenario unfolding. Human behavior at its most dramatic and most relatable, where everyone's assumptions collide with reality in unpredictable ways. Trust, as Sophie began to realize, was the fragile thread running through the entire encounter. Every interaction tested it. Pedro's silence earlier in the week, his measured engagement now, the minor gestures and pauses that seemed loaded with meaning. Sophie wanted to believe desperately that trust could be rebuilt, that the meeting was an opportunity to reset the relationship's emotional clock. But every contradictory signal pulled her back toward doubt, forcing her to weigh optimism against caution. Can trust truly be rebuilt after repeated cycles of avoidance, miscommunication, and jealousy? The audience was left grappling with the same question, invested in the answer as Sophie navigated the emotional minefield. As Pedro's responses alternated between warmth and cool detachment, the comedy of the situation became apparent. Not in a mocking way, but in the sheer unpredictability of human connection. 1 minute, Sophie was euphoric, convinced she was finally being heard, validated, and appreciated. The next, she was scrutinizing his every word for hidden meaning. The oscillation was exhausting but fascinating. A study in the complexities of attachment, perception, and interpersonal dynamics. Every pause, every inflection, every glance had the potential to swing the pendulum of emotion dramatically in either direction. Meanwhile, Julia's subtle guidance kept Sophie grounded, reminding her to observe, reflect, and not overinterpret every nuance. Even with that buffer, Sophie's emotional radar remained hyper alert, catching tiny signals, amplifying them, and creating a suspenseful narrative of highs and lows. The audience could feel the thrill. Every word Pedro spoke or didn't speak became a cliffhanger in itself, a suspenseful beat that heightened engagement and made the next moment irresistible to anticipate. The unpredictability of Pedro's behavior also hinted at future tension. Patterns were emerging. Sophie's intensity eliciting measured detachment, his detachment prompting insecurity, and the cycle repeating. It was both predictable and maddening. A dynamic that could either break them apart or, if navigated carefully, create opportunities for growth and understanding. The stakes were high, the emotional momentum relentless, and the audience remained captivated, eager to see which way the pendulum would swing next. As the meeting progressed, every micro moment carried enormous weight. Pedro's gestures, words, and silences were all part of a subtle dance, while Sophie's reactions, oscillating between hope and doubt, created a palpable emotional tension that resonated with viewers. Julia's watchful presence combined with Sophie's intensity and Pedro's detachment ensured that the encounter remained charged, unpredictable, and impossible to look away from. One message could ruin everything. But what does he say next? The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as Sophie finally confronted Pedro directly. This was the moment she had been building toward for days, rehearsing lines, gauging possible reactions, and bracing for disappointment. Her emotions were raw, a mixture of hope, anxiety, and barely contained frustration. Every word she spoke carried the weight of unprocessed jealousy, lingering insecurities, and the echo of days spent wondering if he cared at all. The room pulsed with anticipation. Each glance, each pause, each subtle sigh adding to the suspense that held the audience captive. Pedro listened, his face calm, eyes steady, almost unreadable. There was a subtle power in his detachment, a quiet control that contrasted sharply with Sophie's heightened energy. Every gesture, his slight lean back, the slow blink, the measured inflection in his voice was calculated, intentional or instinctive to maintain an equilibrium that Sophie could not yet fully access. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't interrupt, yet his silence between her sentences spoke volume, signaling that while he was present, he wasn't emotionally surrendering. This was a classic psychological dynamic. Intensity met neutrality, desperation met restraint, and the tension between the two created a suspenseful push-pull that the audience could feel in their own heart. Sophie's words ranged from pleas for clarity to subtle accusations, particularly around Liz. She questioned whether Liz had really spoken to Pedro about her readiness for a relationship. framing the conversation in terms of betrayal, yet even as she voiced her suspicions, a part of her recognized that blame was easier to assign than introspection. Her unresolved anger toward Liz acted as a lens through which she interpreted Pedro's behavior. If Liz hadn't allegedly interfered, perhaps Pedro's silence wouldn't have felt like rejection. It was a textbook example of how externalizing blame can temporarily soothe internal conflict, even if it amplifies relational tension. At the same time, there were moments of self-reflection in Sophie's dialogue, fleeting glimpses where she admitted in whispers or tentative phrasing that her reactions might be fueled by insecurity as much as by reality. These moments were brief, often overshadowed by the intensity of jealousy and fear, but they hinted at a growing awareness that the emotional storms she felt were not entirely dictated by Pedro or Liz. This layered her character in a way that made her more relatable, more human, and more compelling for the audience. She wasn't simply reactive, she was trying to navigate a messy web of her own creation. Pedro's subtle power moves were evident throughout the exchange. He controlled the tempo of the conversation, carefully choosing which words to emphasize, when to pause, and when to let silence speak. His emotional distance acted as a counterweight to Sophie's intensity, giving him an unspoken authority in the room. Every carefully measured sentence reminded Sophie that control in relationships isn't just about volume or visible dominance, it's about pacing, perception, and the ability to withhold or reveal emotion strategically. The audience could sense this tension on a visceral level. Pedro's calm contrasted with Sophie's fervor, amplifying every reaction and keeping viewers on the edge of their seats. Julia watched silently, stepping in only when necessary. Her interventions minimal but precise, guiding Sophie without undermining her agency. Her presence underscored the volatility of the situation. Sophie needed space to express herself, but without guidance, the emotional intensity could have spiraled into a blowout that would close doors rather than open them. The subtle balancing act was fascinating to observe, mediator, participant, and witness all at once, providing insight while letting the natural tension play out. As the confrontation reached its peak, Sophie's voice quivered between vulnerability and accusation. She wanted reassurance. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted Pedro to close the gap between them emotionally. Pedro gave her moments of small validation. A nod, a gentle tone, a brief eye contact, but he never fully bridged the emotional distance. That distance was deliberate, measured, almost like a silent test. Would Sophie overreach? Would she push too hard? Could she navigate her need for validation without losing composure? The audience felt the stakes. Every misstep could trigger a breakdown. Every subtle gesture could escalate or diffuse the situation. The unresolved blame toward Liz lingered like a shadow, coloring every interpretation Sophie made. It wasn't fully conscious at all times, but it influenced tone, expression, and focus, adding layers to the dynamic. The tension between externalized blame and internal reflection highlighted a key psychological truth. In emotionally charged relationships, past grievances often mix with present fears to create disproportionate reaction. For viewers, this made Sophie's behavior both frustrating and deeply compelling, human, flawed, and relatable in equal measure. As the confrontation drew toward a temporary lull, the audience could feel the uncertainty crackling in the air. Sophie felt she had gained some ground, some clarity, but Pedro's subtle power moves reminded her and the viewers that nothing was fully resolved. Every gesture, pause, and carefully chosen word left room for doubt, questioning, and suspense. The emotional energy remained high, unresolved, and layered with possibility. Sophie thinks she's in control, but Pedro might have other plans. The room felt heavy with unspoken words as Sophie and Pedro navigated the fragile aftermath of their intense confrontation. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the storm had settled, as if some invisible cord of understanding had been threaded between them. Sophie's breathing slowed, her shoulders eased slightly, and a faint relief softened the sharp edges of her anxiety. Pedro, equally measured, maintained a calm presence that suggested a temporary truce, though it was clear this was not a permanent resolution. Only a pause in the ongoing emotional whirlwind. The audience could feel the tension lingering like a charged electric current, fragile and unpredictable. Sophie reflected briefly on the roller coaster she had been through, the suspicion that Liz had meddled, the weeks of ghosting and unanswered messages, and the intense swings of hope and doubt that had dominated her days. She recognized in fleeting clarity that some of her turmoil had been fueled by her own insecurities and by the human tendency to externalize blame. Ghosting, jealousy, and avoidance had all interacted to create an emotional feedback loop, and Sophie could see just for a moment the role she had played in the pattern. The audience could sense the subtle self-awareness, a softening of defensiveness that made her struggles relatable without diminishing the drama. Yet, even in that temporary calm, uncertainty hovered like a shadow. Pedro's careful neutrality, his subtle emotional distance reminded Sophie and the audience that control in relationships is rarely absolute. Every compliment he offered, every nod, every pause could be interpreted in multiple ways. The delicate tension between hope and doubt persisted, a reminder that reconciliation is rarely linear and that emotional dynamics are often more complex than the surface interactions suggest. The audience was left to weigh whether this was a genuine truce or just the calm before another storm. The emotional arcs of the characters converged here. Sophie's jealousy, Pedro's avoidance, and the shadow of Liz's perceived interference created a tapestry of human behavior that was messy, compelling, and deeply relatable. Lessons were embedded in the tension. Unchecked jealousy can distort perception, avoidance amplifies uncertainty, and assigning blame externally can provide temporary relief, but rarely resolves the root issues. Sophie's journey had highlighted how quickly miscommunication and insecurity can escalate, and how fragile trust is when tested by silence and suspicion. The audience could absorb these insights while remaining fully invested in the unfolding drama. Pedro's subtle gestures hinted at both hope and caution. A softening tone, a momentary smile, or an attentive glance suggested that connection was possible, but the underlying tension reminded Sophie that she couldn't take his engagement for granted. The dynamic was a masterclass in restraint, emotional availability balanced with control, attention measured to maintain equilibrium, and communication layered with meaning beyond words. The audience was left observing the delicate interplay, noting how every tiny action carried outsized weight in relationships defined by past hurt and present uncertainty. Sophie's temporary clarity was also tempered by unresolved questions. Could she trust Pedro fully after the week of ghosting? Would her insecurities continue to color interactions? How much of the tension was her own doing? And how much was shaped by Pedro's avoidance or Liz's presence? These questions maintained suspense, keeping the audience emotionally tethered and eager to see what would happen next. Even the smallest gestures, Pedro's tone, a glance, a pause, were loaded with meaning, creating tension that was both psychological and visceral. Humor and reality seeped in alongside the tension. Sophie, despite the intensity of her emotions, occasionally caught herself overanalyzing a small gesture or interpreting a pause as evidence of betrayal. It was a reminder to viewers that human behavior, especially under stress, is often unpredictable and sometimes absurd. The dance between hope, fear, and interpretation is universal, and even within high-drama reality TV, the audience could recognize themselves in Sophie's overthinking, her oscillation between hope and dread, and the subtle comedy of trying to decode another human being. The scene closed with a subtle but powerful shift. Sophie had gained a temporary sense of agency, a momentary foothold in an otherwise chaotic emotional landscape. Pedro's presence and measured engagement suggested possibility, but it also maintained tension, teasing the audience with what could come next. There were no dramatic declarations of resolution, no promises that everything was fixed, only the fragile acknowledgement that the storm had eased for now but could reignite at any moment. The uncertainty itself became the hook, the emotional lever that would carry viewers into the next episode or related drama video. In these final moments, the emotional stakes were clear. Sophie had learned lessons, glimpsed her own role in the cycles of jealousy and blame, and experienced the relief and hope that come with partial reconciliation. Pedro's subtle power moves reminded her and the audience that relationships are a dance of control, vulnerability, and perception. The unresolved questions, the lingering emotional tension, and the interplay between hope and doubt created a perfect cliffhanger for viewers to carry forward. Will Sophie finally get clarity, or is this just the beginning of a bigger meltdown?